Imagine firing up a grill on a sunny weekend, only for a furious neighbor to call the cops, demanding your arrest because they claim you're violating HOA rules. Impossible. Think again. I'm Ethan Parker, and today's saga will show you just how petty some neighbors can be when they're convinced they hold the power to police everyone's backyard. In my case, it started with a simple backyard cookout. I'd just laid fresh charcoal on the grill, the aroma of marinated steaks filling the warm afternoon air. Music was playing softly, and a few friends were on their way over. Everything felt perfect, until I saw my phone light up with a text from a neighbor. "Watch out, Karen's on the warpath." Karen is our HOA's unofficial watchdog, known for enforcing every minor guideline she believes the rest of us are breaking. So I never thought she'd escalate to calling the police. Yet, sure enough, a patrol car rolled up to my driveway, lights flashing. The officer approached me, asking if I was aware I was breaking community restrictions. Stunned, I explained that my backyard was private property, and as far as I knew, grilling wasn't outlawed. But the neighbor insisted otherwise, hounding the officer to issue me a citation or worse. Little did we all know that this would spiral into a neighborhood-wide confrontation, revealing not just Karen's personal vendetta, but the true extent of how far she was willing to go to control our community. Stay tuned to discover how a simple backyard BBQ turned into a full-on standoff, and how the truth behind HOA rules finally emerged, flipping the script on Karen's attempts to see me in handcuffs. Our neighborhood has a history of strict guidelines. Our HOA thrives on well-manicured lawns and uniform fences. Yet, for the most part, residents find a balance between adhering to the rules and enjoying everyday freedoms. Karen, however, is known for taking the rulebook to extremes. She's the type who'll measure grass with a ruler or critique the shade of your curtains if they're not precisely community approved. That day, I decided to invite a few friends over for a small cookout. The sun was shining, and the idea of flipping burgers in my own backyard felt like the perfect way to unwind. Because the HOA's official stance on grilling was ambiguous at best, I'd skimmed the guidelines to ensure I wasn't violating any safety codes. As far as I could tell, there was no outright ban, just a recommendation about open flames near fences. My grill was safely distanced, and I had a small fire extinguisher on hand. I figured I was covered. I'd just seasoned the steaks and set them on the grill when a text from a neighbor alerted me. "Karen's complaining about smoke." Before I could respond, I saw Karen herself storming across my yard, phone in hand. She snapped a picture of my grill and declared, "This is against HOA regulations. I'm calling the cops right now." I tried reasoning with her, explaining that I'd followed all guidelines, but she refused to listen. Sure enough, within minutes, a police car pulled up. The officer looked bemused as Karen demanded I be arrested on the spot. I was too stunned to form a reply. Who calls the police over a backyard BBQ? What I couldn't know then was that this cookout dispute would uncover some shady HOA tactics Karen had been using, and that the entire neighborhood would soon be drawn into the fray. When the officer approached, I calmly explained that my grill was on private property, properly spaced from any structures, and not causing any immediate danger. Karen, arms folded, insisted she'd had enough of my reckless disregard for community standards. She brandished a thick binder, presumably filled with HOA rules, but never opened it to a specific page. The officer asked if I had any official documentation stating I was allowed to grill. Slightly bewildered, I mentioned that my HOA welcome packet never forbade grilling, only recommended caution and certain distances from fences. Sensing the tension, a few curious neighbors gathered, some openly filming the exchange. The officer, realizing this was likely not a criminal matter but a civil or HOA dispute, politely suggested Karen take it up with the HOA board. Karen, glaring, threatened to get them involved immediately. She demanded the officer order me to extinguish the grill. The officer simply shrugged, stating he had no basis for shutting down a legal backyard cookout. Furious, Karen stomped away, phone clutched tight, muttering that she'd have me fined into oblivion. I hoped that would be the end of it, just a petty run-in with a neighbor on a power trip. Little did I know, Karen's next moves would plunge the entire community into a debate about what the HOA could and couldn't enforce. And as the days went by, my simple act of grilling would become the centerpiece of a showdown that dragged my neighbors, the HOA board, and even local authorities back into the spotlight. A few days later, I received an official-looking envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a printout titled, "Updated HOA Guidelines." Strangely, the document included a brand new clause specifically restricting open flame cooking devices, including grills, in backyard spaces. It was dated just 2 days before, conveniently after Karen's police call. Suspicious, I contacted a friend on the HOA board who was equally baffled. He'd never seen these revised guidelines presented or voted on. In fact, the board hadn't held any recent sessions to approve policy changes. That raised a red flag. Karen might have taken it upon herself to update the regulations unofficially. My friend told me privately that Karen had been pressuring certain board members to pass stricter rules on barbecue grills, claiming they were a nuisance and a fire hazard. However, no official consensus was reached. This so-called update was likely Karen's personal handiwork, meant to intimidate me. The realization that my neighbor might be forging or manipulating HOA documents to get her way felt surreal. I decided to compare the updated guidelines to the original HOA bylaw. Sure enough, there were glaring inconsistencies, mismatched formatting, odd word choices, and no board signatures. This discovery marked a critical twist. Karen wasn't just being overzealous, she was possibly breaking rules herself. If she was this determined to police my backyard, what else might she be cooking up behind the scenes? Word spread quickly after I shared screenshots of Karen's suspicious, updated guidelines in our neighborhood's online chat group. Residents chimed in with mixed reactions. Some were outraged, calling out Karen's blatant overreach, while others were nervous, unsure if these changes were real and worried about potential fines. Meanwhile, a few neighbors shared that Karen had been pestering them for weeks. One family who loved weekend cookouts said she'd threatened to shut them down if they didn't follow her safety code. Another homeowner admitted they'd stopped using their fire pit altogether for fear of incurring Karen's wrath. The tension in the community escalated as people realized Karen was using these fictitious rules to police private backyards. Some had even paid fines that she claimed were legitimate. The more we learned, the clearer it became that Karen thrived on intimidation, and for too long residents had complied rather than question her authority. As my neighbors and I compared notes, a sense of collective frustration grew. How had one person managed to terrorize so many into abandoning their own property rights? Why had the HOA board not intervened? The next board meeting, scheduled for the following week, loomed as a potential powder keg. All signs pointed to a major showdown, with Karen at the center, forced to defend her questionable updates in front of the entire community. Amid the rising tension, a couple of neighbors dug into Karen's background on the HOA board. We discovered that she held a minor position, not enough to pass regulations on her own, yet she acted like she ran the place. Some folks suspected she was aiming for a top spot on the board, hoping to transform these made-up restrictions into legitimate bylaws. We also learned that Karen had once run an online campaign complaining about irresponsible grilling, posting photos of supposed fire damage from neighboring communities, though sources indicated those images weren't even from our state. Her scare tactics had convinced a few board members to consider tighter grill rules. Clearly, she was determined to use fear as a stepping stone to power. Complicating matters further, some older residents expressed fear about pushing back. One elderly neighbor recounted receiving a warning notice after Karen caught the faint smell of barbecue from her patio. The neighbor hadn't grilled in months, yet she feared any confrontation might lead to more harassment or mysterious HOA fines. It became evident that we were dealing with more than a neighborly dispute over a backyard barbecue. Karen's attempts to criminalize normal activities suggested a deeper power grab, one that thrived on fear and confusion. If she succeeded in swaying enough board members with her alarming anecdotes, her personal vendetta against grilling, and those who dared to question her, might become a permanent rule. We needed a plan to reveal the truth before it was too late. As the upcoming HOA board meeting approached, I found myself torn. Part of me wanted to keep grilling regardless, to prove that Karen had no real power, but I also worried she might try another extreme measure, like calling the police again or forging even more documents. The stress weighed on me, especially since I enjoyed hosting friends for barbecue. Giving that up felt like caving to bullying. Others in the neighborhood felt similarly trapped. One father canceled his son's birthday cookout, fearing Karen might escalate matters. A single mother, who normally grilled hot dogs for her kids on Sundays, felt uneasy continuing the tradition. Every conversation ended with the same question. But what if Karen shows up? Meanwhile, a few neighbors, perhaps intimidated or simply conflict-averse, suggested we just avoid grilling until the board clarified the rules. Their logic was that no one wanted a scene, especially not with local police showing up again, but yielding to intimidation only emboldened Karen, and many of us believed we had to stand our ground. In these emotional interactions, the real cost of Karen's campaign became evident. Our community spirit, friendly backyard gatherings, easy neighborly chats, was fracturing under fear of confrontation. Stepping into my own backyard no longer felt relaxing, it felt like a potential battlefield. Even so, the desire for normalcy pushed us forward, inching closer to a decisive moment when we'd either reclaim our rights or see them eroded by one person's obsessive control. Days before the HOA board meeting, a dramatic development ramped up the tension. Karen called the police on yet another resident, claiming they were illegally grilling at 9 p.m. The neighbor, a quiet, elderly man, was left shaken by the late-night visit from law enforcement. Although no citation was issued, the encounter struck fear into the rest of us. Who would be next? Simultaneously, evidence surfaced that Karen had submitted a formal request to the board to ban all outdoor cooking appliances, citing numerous resident complaints. However, many in the community said they never lodged any such complaint, raising suspicions about Karen fabricating them. As if this wasn't enough, the local news station caught wind of our unusual predicament. A reporter reached out, hoping to feature our grilling drama in a segment about overbearing HOA rules. The idea of media coverage divided neighbors further. Some thought public exposure could force the board to take swift action, while others worried it would only escalate Karen's need for retribution. Against this backdrop, the HOA board meeting promised high drama. Residents braced themselves for a fierce debate over fundamental rights, like the freedom to barbecue on private property, versus Karen's crusade against an unacceptable hazard. Everyone could sense we were on the brink of a turning point, with our sense of community either reaffirmed or fractured beyond repair. In the lead-up to the board meeting, a small group of us formed an informal coalition. We gathered testimonials from neighbors who felt harassed by Karen, compiled photographic evidence of her unauthorized warning signs, and discovered at least 3 updates to the HOA guidelines that had never been officially approved. Meanwhile, we connected with a longtime resident who'd been around since the HOA's founding. She confirmed that any rule changes required a 2/3 majority vote and official filing. None of Karen's so-called updates met that standard. This revelation fueled our resolve to publicly challenge her authority. We also learned that Karen had been weaving a manipulative narrative behind the scenes. Some residents believed her stories about near-miss fire incidents, though no one could pinpoint when or where they occurred. Still, a few older board members seemed swayed by Karen's fear-mongering, voicing caution about accidental fires. Our job was to present facts over fear, showing that safe grilling, done responsibly, posed no real threat. As we traded evidence and strategies, the camaraderie among us blossomed. Neighbors who rarely spoke were suddenly working together, united by a desire to protect our right to enjoy our own backyards. Through these subplots, others' experiences with intimidation, uncovered misinformation, and a shared determination, we solidified our plans for the upcoming meeting. We intended to confront Karen and the board with irrefutable proof of her manipulations and reaffirm our right to grill in peace. The night of the HOA board meeting finally arrived. The community center buzzed with energy. An unusually large crowd had gathered, many armed with printouts, photos, and even videos of Karen's confrontations. The atmosphere felt electric, a mixture of apprehension and confidence. After a few routine agenda items, the board opened the floor to discuss neighborhood safety and grilling policies. Karen seized the moment, stepping forward with a prepared statement. She rattled off a list of supposed fire risks, brandished photographs of charred grills, likely sourced from Google, not from our neighborhood, and ended her speech with a dramatic appeal. For the sake of our children's future, we must ban outdoor grilling immediately. That's when the tide turned. One by one, neighbors lined up to speak. They calmly explained how Karen's calls to the police had been baseless, how her so-called updated guidelines didn't match official bylaws, and how they'd felt bullied by her actions. I presented evidence of her forging rules and the testimonies of multiple residents she'd threatened. Murmurs spread through the crowd as the board members pored over the documents we provided. A notable hush fell when an elderly neighbor recalled Karen's midnight call to the police about illegal grilling. Even some of Karen's few supporters exchanged uneasy glances. We had reached a critical turning point. Either the board would side with her fear-mongering or see the truth behind her manipulative campaign against backyard barbecues. The room seemed to hold its breath as I stepped up to the microphone, responding directly to Karen's dire claims. With calm precision, I laid out each piece of evidence: the original bylaws that allowed grilling within safety guidelines, the unapproved updates Karen had circulated, and the testimonies from neighbors who had been unjustly threatened. Karen, visibly flustered, tried to interrupt, claiming I tampered with official documents, but the board reminded her to wait her turn. Several neighbors then backed me up, detailing how she'd singled them out for minor infractions or non-existent rules. One neighbor even produced texts where Karen boasted about calling the cops again if she saw so much as smoke. Karen's frustration boiled over. She shouted that grilling was a menace to public safety and that we'd regret ignoring her warnings. Yet, her claims lacked evidence, and the board members, some of whom had been grilling enthusiasts themselves, seemed unconvinced. Sensing the momentum shift, Karen tried a final tactic, calling upon the elderly board members she had scared into supporting her. But they hesitated. When pressed for details, they admitted they'd never actually witnessed any fire hazard. The hush that followed felt like the release of tension in the air. Karen, cornered, stood trembling with anger at the front of the room. The confrontation had exposed her manipulations to everyone, and the entire community waited to see what the board would decide. As the confrontation reached its peak, the board chair called for a brief recess, pulling the other members aside to review the evidence. Karen hovered nearby, frantically whispering to a couple of her allies. Meanwhile, the crowd exchanged hopeful glances, convinced that the board would see through her charade. The tension soared when a local reporter, who'd been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward for a quick interview. She asked me how I felt about possibly being arrested for grilling on my own property. I answered plainly, "It's outrageous that one neighbor's personal vendetta could escalate to police involvement over something as harmless as a backyard cookout." Karen, eavesdropping, spun around, once again proclaiming she was acting in the community's best interest. A few onlookers groaned. It was clear her credibility had taken a massive hit. The assembled neighbors murmured, all eyes swinging between Karen's anxious stance and the board huddled in the corner. We knew the final verdict was imminent. Would the board side with Karen's alarmist vision of the neighborhood, or uphold the rights of residents to grill safely? At last, the board chair returned to the microphone, face grave but resolute. In the next moments, we'd discover if Karen's campaign against backyard barbecues would be validated or dismissed once and for all. The entire room fell silent, bracing for the decision that could define our neighborhood's future stance on both grilling and the limits of HOA power. The board chair cleared his throat, the room so quiet you could hear faint footsteps in the hall. After reviewing the presented evidence, Keaton, he began, "We've concluded that no official bylaw prohibits backyard grilling, provided residents follow basic safety guidelines." A ripple of relief spread among the crowd, but he wasn't done. "Additionally, we see no record of any approved updates to our regulations that would ban grilling. Therefore, any such documentation is invalid." Karen's jaw dropped. She opened her binder to protest, but the chair cut her off politely. "We've also noted multiple reports of harassment and unauthorized rule enforcement attributed to you. We take these allegations seriously." The hush deepened. Could the board really be holding Karen accountable? Another board member stepped in, addressing Karen directly. "We appreciate your concern for safety, but forging updated rules and repeatedly calling the police on neighbors for personal grievances is unacceptable." A quiet cheer erupted from the back of the room, quickly shushed by others who wanted to hear every word. Finally, the chair announced two decisive measures. First one, the HOA would officially reaffirm the original guidelines allowing safe grilling. Second, the board would issue a formal reprimand to Karen for overstepping her authority and creating false documents. If further incidents occurred, she could face removal from any HOA position and possibly legal consequences. Karen, red-faced, tried to blurt out excuses, but the stunned crowd drowned her out with applause. The officer who'd arrived that day for my supposed arrest had also come to the meeting, quietly taking notes. He shook his head, a wry smile on his lips, clearly relieved this neighborhood dispute had a lawful end. The final verdict was in, grilling was here to stay, and Karen's hold over the community had officially shattered. In the days after the meeting, the atmosphere around our neighborhood shifted dramatically. People felt free to hold cookouts again, no longer jumping at every flash of smoke or sizzle of meat on the grill. Karen's influence waned. While she still lived here, she kept a far lower profile, seemingly aware that any further stunts could lead to serious repercussions. Neighbors began sharing recipes, inviting one another for backyard gatherings, and jokingly referring to Karen's grilling ban as a cautionary tale of what happens when someone abuses HOA rules for personal vendettas. Even the board started discussing ways to clarify guidelines so no one could pull a similar trick in the future, an outcome that would, ironically, improve our community's cohesion. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I felt a wave of relief. I no longer worried about turning on the grill or hosting friends. Instead, I embraced the renewed sense of camaraderie that had blossomed from our shared challenge. We had faced Karen's intimidation head-on, exposing her misuse of fabricated documents and fear-mongering tactics. Looking back, this saga served as a vital lesson. HOAs exist to maintain harmony, not to arm individuals with the power to bully neighbors. When residents unite, armed with facts and solidarity, even the most aggressive rule enforcer can be disarmed. And yes, my steaks taste even better now that I can grill them without looking over my shoulder. If you enjoyed this story or have your own experience dealing with overzealous neighbors, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment below with any grilling horror stories or tips you have. Let's keep our backyards free from unwarranted drama and full of sizzling good times.